T, are we ready? Good to go? Okay, everybody, we're on the afternoon shift. And I want to introduce Professor John Tobin. As I said, he's from the Melbourne Law School. In fact, he's the Francine V. McNiff Chair in International Human Rights Law, which I think is a great title, and co-director of the Studies for the Human Rights Program in the Master of Laws, and the co-director of the Research in Human Rights within the Institute for International Law and Humanities.
Yes.
A lot of administration there.
Yes, exactly. Keeps me busy.
I bet you're glad you're not in our faculty, because if you get that much administration in our faculty, you get like 300 hours to do it in the whole year. But John's going to talk with us today about children's rights.
Yep, exactly. Thanks, Nicola. So thanks so much for having me. I want to begin obviously by acknowledging that we're gathering today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. And I think in a contest like this, and we'll come to this conversation, what's it mean for us, academics, scholars, researchers, activists, working around childhood and particularly thinking about what that looks like from the perspective of a young Indigenous child in this country right now. The highest rate of incarceration of any group in this country, the highest rate of removal from their home of any group in this country. We can do a lot better than we need to as well. So it's something to think about and reflect on. I'll come back to that as well. I've also got a new role. I'm Associate Dean Diversity and Inclusion in the law school. So the presentation before lunch was really interesting from my perspective in terms of the challenges that are happening in America, and I think will flow into what's happening in our part of the world as well. So we have to be really aware of that also.
Yeah, I think we're very conscious of
so
that.
it's interesting times. I'll come to that. Look, I am a lawyer by training, so I don't have the same experience or the same language that you bring to this conversation. But what I want to try and do, I suppose, is introduce to you the idea of what a rights-based approach or human rights for children might add to your conversations around childhood in your disciplinary areas as well. Okay, so it's about sort of throwing up ideas that may make a connection, and what that looks like we can talk about as well. I've got, I think, another 10 minutes or so there's a lot to cover, and I'm just going to really scratch the surface because there's so much in this space as well. What I've tried to do is really respond to some of the things that came up in conversations this morning and then try and attached to those big ideas where the idea of a child as a rights bearer fits in. So how would it add value? How would it rethink, reshape the way in which other disciplines might think about childhood as well? Okay, so that's the backdrop, and this is obviously just a small collection of ideas, and I'm very happy to explore this both in Q&A but also beyond as well. I'm here most of the time, and the law school across the road, and clearly I've got a great passion for children's rights and childhood, have 4 kids of my own, and so there is lived experience through all these parts of life as well, and then some academic stuff which doesn't always align with how I should act as a parent, I should add also. So just start with childhood as the idea, underpinning sort of connecting feature of our conversations today. So clearly from the perspective of me as an international legal scholar, I think through a prism it says, okay, that means anyone under the age of 18, okay?
Yeah.
So it's a legal definition.
And that's where I started, but I've learned so much since then.
Yeah, and then so then keep in mind, of course, there are 18 plus. What's that look like in terms of rights? There's a whole conversation there as well. What about within the 0 to 18 age group? Different categories and cohorts of children. We think about it in terms of being early, middle, childhood in terms of the CRC, but the key point, I suppose, is that what it says is that international law says that when it comes to that cohort of young people or people, anyone age 18 gets these special rights. Okay, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, I'm assuming you've all hopefully heard of it. If not, I can go into the details, but I've written a whole book. It's like 2,000 pages on what it actually looks like in practice. But this is about saying, well, what do children need? What are their interests? And which interests are so critical and vital that we have to create and turn them into a right? This is a really important point. So once I say an interest is a right, it says it's an obligation. So I'm saying this particular interest is so vital, so critical to a child's sense of self in terms of their dignity in this world, that they have to be recognised as having a right in that interest. Education, housing, etc., right? And once you create that right, you create then an accountability, which I want to come back to. It's a really important point. And that's the difference, I suppose, from a rights-based model as opposed to other models, which might be based on charity or ethics of care or obligations or whatever it might be as well. Rights is about interest plus obligation, duty bearer, and then the one who's entitled. The second point is this idea of being global, right? So the convention in theory says that every child in every corner of the world and every jurisdiction of the world is entitled to those same rights. So they get them all. This is a global vision for childhood. We can unpack that in terms of, well, is it really or not afterwards? But I do want to flag that this is an expectation that every state is supposed to say, well, we're going to take measures to actually translate these interests and obligations into practice in every aspect of a child's life. Fairly daunting when you think about it in terms of the scope, but it's certainly the vision and the expectation of states. Now, keep in mind, as you would have all heard, every state in the world, bar America, has ratified this document. So in theory, every state's got a legal obligation to take these steps to translate these ideas, these rights into practice for children as well. So it's global. But to go back to your point this morning, culture, right? So how do we give meaning to these rights? How do we interpret them? We've heard a lot about decolonising various aspects of early childhood education. We've heard about decolonising ways of thinking and knowing and being as well. In some respects, we have to be thinking about the same ideas when it comes to the language. So I'll tell you there's a right to education under the convention. I'll tell you there's a right to development under the convention. There's a right to culture and practice culture. And you're going to say to me, well, I'm going to talk to you, John, about what that actually means. Does that make sense? This is the first point of intersection. So I can give you as an obligation for the state to actually do these things. Okay, and then the question becomes, well, what's it look like in practice? How do we interpret that? Who gives it meaning? Okay, and historically, as you're probably aware, in terms of the human rights movement, very Western Eurocentric, but my argument very much is that that is not inevitable, and in fact, on the contrary, it must be much more grassroots based and what we call vernacularised. Okay, so local communities give meaning to rights as they exist in their own communities as well. So a colleague of mine who's sadly passed away, Sally Mary, who you may have heard of, an anthropologist, has done some great work around what does culture mean, and she talks about it in three contexts. So you talk about culture as being national identity, things that associate with who are to be an Australian or American or a Canadian or Chinese, wherever it might be. So culture is tradition, so very much a backward-looking notion, so things that were done in the past as historical practices. That's in a silly degrading, dehumanising way often. So Australians would often have a negative expectation, understanding of, for example, First Nations culture historically. And then she talks about, from my perspective, culture as being contentious, which is what sort of leads into your work. So culture is never fixed, it's always static. And the question becomes, well, who is involved in making decisions that develop the practices and inform how we do things and the way we live? Does that make sense? So on what terms, on whose interests are we developing cultural practices? And then that takes us to, first of all, this is never going to stay still. We have to recognise the underlying power that informs any cultural practice, which really goes to the conversation with Narita before the break. Okay, and then we take us to the point about communication. How do we do this? So the linchpin of a rights-based approach for the convention is this idea of children's views being central. Okay, so we as adults, whether we like it or not, we sort of devalue, because our culture tells us to do that, the views and interests of children. And even though we're all trained academically to change and challenge that dominant perception, I think we still do it. I find it all the time as a parent, just defaulting to devalue, I'm the expert, they're the child, right? You've got to keep saying, no. Communication under a rights-based approach changes entirely. Okay, so it says under Article 12, which you've hopefully all been aware of, it's sort of a central part of the conversation, in every matter affecting a child, the child's views, must be heard. We have to give effect and we have to enable them to actually express their views on anything that affects a child. Now, I haven't got time to discuss how broad that scope is, but it's pretty much everything when you think about it as well, okay? And the important part of the conversation is not that children's views are determinative of issues, but they become things that are given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity, all right? So there's a balance exercise in there as well. This point really is significant because it's saying now the rules of the game are changing. Okay, so anything that happens in any part of our life that we do with young people or we have an impact on their lives, we're supposed to be communicating with them. How we do it then becomes critical. So we value what I'm doing. Talking, PowerPoint slides, refereed articles, okay? For a child in the child's world, they're kind of not necessarily the ways in which they're going to communicate. And we heard this morning about thinking about adults retraining our minds to start thinking, well, how do we enable, scaffold, and then hear and take seriously the views of children? Okay, so it's all the things we're talking about, right? So it's not the written journal article, it's not the speech or lectern, it's the body language, it's the sign language, it's the verbal, pre-verbal, it's the emotions, it's the dancing, it's the withdrawals, all those things that happen. And then, of course, understanding that, you know, how do we then give value and meaning to those children from very, very early ages. And as you would know from colleagues in education, we're not talking necessarily about kids who are 15 plus, we're talking about kids the minute they come into this world. So there's challenges there about us respecting, recognising, and then enabling, scaffolding, and hearing and taking seriously those views as well. So it changes the whole cultural communication conversation, right? They're now competent, active participants in issues that affect their lives, and pretty much everything affects their lives. And then in terms of scope, goes to the presentation, you were talking about bodily integrity and sexual education. You know, those ideas are just two examples of rights that the Convention recognises. And the point about that is that it links to a broader notion of dignity, okay? So this is sort of the normative foundation of human rights law. What's it mean to live a life of dignity? And the Convention maps out some of those expectations, but children have to become participants in that themselves, okay? Article 12 again, in every matter affecting child, what are they expressing in terms of their views too, all right? So huge scope, and importantly again from your perspective, if you're arguing for things like there should be sexual education in schools, then I can tell you, well, international says yes, there must. And I'll give you lots of citations from very significant international bodies that support your claims. The point about that is there's often a coalescence of the research you're doing on the ground with the international expectations that exist under international law. The argument I would make would be, well, let's bring them together, okay, to obviously advance and amplify the capacity of our arguments to have impact on how states do their work or not do their work with children as well. Which brings me particularly to the First Nations children as well. So I think this is a really important point. And it goes back to the idea about culture and communication global. The Convention is often seen as being a Western-centric document, just reflects Western values. Can I just say, please don't accept that argument. It's made routinely. It's just far too simplistic. Simple response and justification is this. The Convention is a very abstract document, very high level. We call it incompletely theorised, which means that we can infuse it with meaning from a very local perspective, this idea of vernacularisation again. So Sally Mary's work with women in India experiencing domestic violence. They use rights as a really powerful tool to make their claims. I think Renita mentioned this morning, rights for Indigenous peoples becomes a really powerful claiming mechanism. Don't give us charity, don't give us discretion. We have entitlements, you must respect them, okay? So when it comes to our First Nations people, okay, and our children, the 2 points. One, rights aren't simply individualistic in the way you see in the US Supreme Court. It's relational, which is something I've picked up this morning as well. How do they exist in relation to others, both other children, other adults, communities? How do we get the balancing right? What's that look like? Okay, but also they are going to be culturally specific in terms of how they're understood and how they're utilised as well. All right, so we're seeing that in Victoria with what's happening in the efforts around treaty and other issues concerning truth-telling to say we have certain rights as First Nations people, as First Nations children, okay, governments should be accountable to recognise and respect those rights as well. So it's a really important point about culturally adapting, enabling, informing this idea of childhood for these global standards. Does that make sense? There's a flexibility and adaptability there that I think is really important and really empowering as well. Two last points and I'll finish. One is the issue of accountability. This is really critical because, as I said before, you know, when I grew up, I went to a Catholic school, educated by the Christian Brothers. Yes, lots of things happened there that shouldn't have happened, but there was some good things in terms of we were told service, social justice, etc., values around looking after the other, and they're all based in some sort of religious creed and need to respect that. But of course, you know, in many cases, certain religious, including my Catholic upbringing and other value systems, will be very selective in who gets the care that's being delivered. Okay? Or you might have a charitable fund who wants to save children from whatever it might be, okay? All those systems can deliver good outcomes, but they are also very dangerous because they are selective in who gets the benevolent behaviour. Does that make sense? Right says, no, every child, don't care what they've done, don't care where they come from, don't care who they are, they get this right because every child is entitled to a life of dignity. Right? So we're going to challenge it. Now that is unbelievably politically challenging. This is about power. At the end of the day, it's about how we redistribute power to children, to marginalised groups, okay? It's in Australia, in our youth justice system. Believe me, it's happening right up there now in Queensland. We're locking up Indigenous kids in ways that will just make you want to cry, okay? Rights is, you can't be doing that. You've got to be held accountable for that as well. So it adds a layer to other conversations for justice. Like, does that make sense? So when we're saying it's not just a discretionary or a charity or a benevolence, it's no, you have legal obligations under both Australian law, we have a Charter of Rights in this state as well, by the way, and also under international law as well. And then it goes to the point of challenges, which is exactly what happened with Doreen's presentation. This is the bottom line, right? It's about power and politics. And so whenever you're seeking to change any dominant practice concerning children, and that could be the smallest thing around how we, organise sport training at a local school, or whether girls should wear skirts or allowed to wear long pants for netball or shorts, you are always going to be challenging dominant cultural practices that generally seek to marginalise, disempower and silence children as well. We're seeing that on a vastly larger scale in America now for all groups that under a human rights model are entitled to equality, which means special measures to address and alleviate their marginalisation and oppression, right? So on a human rights basis, it's not an issue, right? You have to have special measures because structurally the system is not level, it's clearly built in ways that cause serious harm to certain groups. So this challenge here, I don't want to underestimate rather, how political some of this stuff can be. And that then comes to a whole thing about the language of persuasion, how we actually, in my role, actually agitate for children's rights. So in Sweden, I've got a nice mandate, right? You've got legislative recognition. In Australia right now, I can tell you that if I went to a federal government or state government and talked about every child having a right, they'd look at me like, get him out of here, he's a troublemaker. Why? Because it's destabilising, it's powerful, it's political. So there's conversations there for us in terms of collaboration about where can you use it to leverage and inform the way we think about childhood and children, but there's other conversations about, well, how do we get change in behaviour? What do we do to actually persuade certain groups to understand the values underpinning a rights-based approach and not be dissuaded by fear or anxiety about the politics of what that looks like in practice as well. Does that make sense? So the last point I'll make, and I'll shut up, is I was at a meeting last week and members were talking about why we're all there, and everyone said they're there because children are vulnerable and we want to help them, right? It's a noble, well-motivated intention, okay? And children are vulnerable, but so too are we. The point I'd say about that is that the risk is if we are solely motivated by that, then we risk defining children by reference to their vulnerabilities. Does that make sense? Yeah. The minute we do that, we're the experts, okay? Yeah. And we're acting on them rather than with them or for them as well. So under a rights-based approach, you recognise the vulnerability, but you don't define children by their vulnerabilities. You recognise their competencies, you enable and scaffold and support their competencies, their expertise, and you work to either work with them as co-creators or co-collaborators, or you empower them, of course, to act on their own or in groups as well. So it's a big difference, and that's partly the big thing in most sectors where professionals are committed to children. They want to do the right things. We sometimes have what I call a welfarist approach. We are very much informed by, let's help and save the children. Underpins the entire policy of stolen children in this country, as you all know, and I still don't think we've actually come to realise that that lingers deeply in most of our social policies, which is tricky, right, because the intentions are good, but our method and execution may sometimes, in fact, not necessarily lead to the most optimal outcomes for children in terms of their rights and their empowerment as well. So I'll stop there because I could go a lot longer. And happy to take responses, questions, queries, criticisms, whatever it might be as well.
That was amazing. What a succinct and appropriate summary. And can I start off with the accountability thing? So why aren't we held accountable for incarcerating 10-year-olds in the Northern Territory in Queensland? I just don't understand.
Yeah, so...
How do they get away with it?
It's how do they get away with it? Yeah, if Nellie Lewis was here, my colleague who's the Children's Commissioner, she'd probably throw her hands up in despair and say, because too many white folk don't understand the implications of bad laws on Indigenous kids. It's bottom line, right? So what's happened up in Queensland, for those who don't know, is that there's a bit of a crime wave, and so the response was, let's get tough on crime, and let's then lock up kids. You do the adult crime, you do the time. As a consequence, there's a disproportionate impact on Indigenous children who are now being locked up either in watch houses or for excessive periods of time. And politically, there is a charter or a Bill of Rights in Queensland, but the government literally explicitly said we will override the obligation under both the Convention on the Rights of the Child and obligations under the Queensland Charter when it comes to ensuring that we don't detain children unless it's a measure of last resort. So it's political will, right? So people just don't seem to, and it's just depressing, right?
Yeah.
That we, and then the other part of this conversation is that approach actually is worse for everyone in terms of the outcomes for law and order and public safety. It doesn't actually address those concerns. Politically, it wins votes. And of course, young children, particularly Indigenous children, suffer immeasurably as well.
On the ABC breakfast this morning, there was a lawyer on, I think it was a dean of business at Lismore or somewhere, saying that in fact what's happened is the incarceration rates have gone up in terms of numbers for children as young as 10, but the actual crime levels have not gone down. So it's just a waste of time.
It doesn't work. The evidence tells us that again and again. And that's the problem. You know this in your own field of work. Evidence doesn't necessarily inform policy.
No.
It's politics.
It's a very loose slippage with that term, evidence-based approach.
It doesn't happen. So so it's the accountability, the power stuff becomes key to that as well.
Other people got comments or? Sorry,
what can we do?
Great question. It's a good question. So the answer is probably another more complex and detailed conversation around this. So I'm just part of a group now with 54 Reasons to Save the Children and a couple of colleagues, Amanda Third and Sharon Bessel, who work in social media and poverty, really great academics. And we're creating an Australian Centre for Children's Rights, and part of the objective behind that is to raise awareness about what a rights-based approach looks like in various professional contexts. So early childhood, education, public health, youth justice, whatever it might be as well. And then how do we then provide the advocacy tools as well to help people and agitate and advocate for that particular approach as well. A lot of it's grassroots because politically, children's rights and children aren't really going to win votes, right? Which is desperately depressing. So there's no easy solution, but the bottom line, I think, is awareness raising, education, and then grassroots advocacy, and then demonstrating that this model actually works. So 54 Reasons has done some great work in Queensland with child protection, particularly Indigenous children, rolled it out amongst communities, and they've found that this model actually is better for staff in terms of the ease which they deliver services, the satisfaction, and then much better for families and children as well. So there's now generating an evidence-based evidence base around the effectiveness of this model as well. So it's a slow burn, right? It's not easy.
How could you sleep at night when you were responsible for sending an 11-year-old into an incarceration facility?
So the rationale will be we're keeping people safe. So what happens is, again, so early childhood kids are warm and fuzzy, we love them, they're cute, and then when they start doing, and then with child protection we feel sorry for them because, they're having a bad life. When they start offending, folk devils, right? They're dangerous, they're threatening. Your safety is far more important than them being recognised as being a human being. So we locked them up. Northern Territory dropped their age of responsibility from 12 to 10, right?
Wow.
Yeah. We're going up to 12. We were going to go to 14, we dropped it back to 12. So we're too scared to go up. This is an issue of courage. So part of it's about lobbying our leaders, but absolutely politics.
Courage.
Absolutely politics.
So that
Globally as well, not just here. Globally.
related to the what should we do is thinking about the situation in Gaza and what's happening with those children.
Yeah.
How does that impact the discussion on children's rights?
That's probably a conversation that's too complex for me to try and understand. I mean, I think what it demonstrates it again is that...
Or even to say what's happening and coming to the US, the children of the United States.
Yeah. So I think again, it demonstrates that people will tell you they care for children, they don't.
No.
Right, this is the bottom line. So And then once you recognise that, like you all do, right? You are all motivated by a deep ethical, moral, spiritual, whatever it might be, commitment to, I want to actually empower and support and enable children. Many people don't have that view, right? And I do this quite explicitly in my classes. You look at, so the history, even going back in time. So when we only started worrying about infant mortality when expanding colonial states said, gee whiz, we need to have more people being born so we can keep expanding our armies and we can provide workers to expand the capitalist base, right? It wasn't about, oh gee whiz, kids are dying, we better save them, or women are dying. It was entirely instrumental. And so much of what's still happening in our world today is about seeing kids as either collateral damage or in instrumentalist terms. Even education, I would say, is invariably instrumentalist. Are we actually focusing on the development of the child, or are we actually developing widgets to go out in society and fill our needs in certain areas as well? We don't. So I think, and that's kind of a depressing thought to have, but clearly politicians both in this country and in America and others don't care enough about children. Refugee detention, last 25 years, it's been horrendous, right? So.
Hence the United States haven't signed this.
Yeah, well, they wanted to be
Right.
able to execute kids under 18 and send them to war, that's right, yeah. Yeah, so it's
It's
kind
a
of,
declaration, almost, they're not signing it, a declaration of the unevenness of children's rights, depending on things like race.
yeah, it's a bit depressing at times. But keep in mind, there are some people doing amazing things. But I mean, Gaza's the ultimate expression of depression, isn't it? I mean, you've got thousands of kids dying. Yeah.
Just commented to Angela in response to you, Lauren Lundy has been doing great work on children's rights in Gaza.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a close colleague of mine as well. Yeah, but it's hard, right?
We are
Thank you.
optimistic, Alex.
We have to, hope is what drives us and motivates us, exactly.
Amazing. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
No worries.
Because
No worries. Thank you.
tangible ways forward that are optimistic and actually actionable.
Sorry.
So, thank you, John. Thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure.